Well, good evening. How's everybody this evening? A little chilly. We're all acting like it's winter out here. I'm Kate. I'm with the Kensington Historical Society. We're going to get started on time for the benefit of those who are on time. We may get some people sprinkle in, and that's fine too. What we're going to do tonight is have a talk. We'll have Q&A after. For those of you who might not be aware, we are taping this. Montgomery Municipal Cable tapes for us so that we can post videos on our website so people can view later. So if you could, just check your phones and get them off, because we don't have phones in the background. That would be a big help. And thank you to the town of Kensington for hosting this, for Montgomery Municipal Cable for taking care of us from a tech standpoint, as well as doing the recording. And I understand we've got some people maybe from Chevy Chase Historical Society too. Yay, good. Like collaborative programming and all that good stuff. So it's my pleasure to introduce Eric. And I took a visit last month or whenever out to the Trolley Museum. If you haven't been, you really need to go. It's a very cool place, not far out, Georgia and something Road, Layhill Road. And yeah, they've got a great building, exhibits, a track that they run cars on. But the most fun thing is this big barn of trolley cars, and every trolley car has a story. Where was it from? Where was it used? How was it acquired? So they all have kind of personalities, and then that's really cool too. And Kensington Historical Society has a good friend named Chris that we see at the train show every year. He's out working at the trolley barn in the archives, and that's quite something, because apparently the trolley service was very good at record keeping. So there's a lot of stuff in the archives, and once it gets sorted and organized, it'll see the light of day, and we'll all really enjoy that. Fun thing about Eric, I think, is he's a professional transportation guy. He was working with transit and rail in DC and the region and in other states with rail safety and stuff. So his roots are transit. So what a cool thing for somebody to do who had a professional career in transit, to go to a museum about trolleys and transit. I was a banker. I can think of nothing worse than being in a museum of banking history, but you know, trolley sounds fun to me. So we're going to let him give his presentation, and then we'll take questions at the end. We're on Zoom, so we'll take Zoom questions too. So those of you on Zoom, get your questions ready. So Eric, enjoy.
All right, thank you very much, Kate. So good evening, everyone. My name is Eric Madison, and I am the Executive Director for the National Capital Trolley Museum. As Kate said, I have a long history. My background is in transportation. I started actually in transportation back in about 2003. I used to work for the DC Department of Transportation, working in the State Safety Oversight Program, and also working on the planning for what was now the DC Streetcar. After that, I did safety oversight for WMATA, and then I moved on to doing private contractor work, and worked with the Department of Defense out at the Pentagon. And one of my colleagues, former colleagues from there, is here this evening, so we're sharing some war stories. And then after that, I went to the Federal Transit Administration, where I continued working in state safety oversight and rail transit safety, and then joined the consulting world again, and then hit a point where I was getting to the midlife, and I thought about, well, what am I doing with my life? And throughout all of this, I had been a volunteer at the Trolley Museum. I actually started there in 1998 as a volunteer, and was a volunteer up until about this time last year, when they approached me about becoming the executive director. And so I was between jobs, and I thought, well, I've already been here for over 25 years anyway, so I always say that my job, the job that I'm in right now, it became as a result of the longest job interview I've ever had. But I am pleased to be here this evening, and I would like to thank Kate and the Kensington Historical Society for inviting me out to talk about the Kensington line. This is a topic that we're trying to do more outreach to the community, where we can go out to the community in places where streetcars used to run and kind of reintroduce people to the streetcar if they used to ride streetcars, or talk about some of the local history. Chris Highland, who is our archivist here at the museum, has been working with us for almost a year now, and so he's been coming in about 3 days a week to do a lot of the work of digging through boxes of slides and photographs and just historical objects to come up with some of this. So I encourage you after the presentation to come up to the tables and take a look at some of the objects that we've brought over from the museum that are related to streetcars in Kensington and in Chevy Chase. So as I begin, a little bit about us. The Trolley Museum is located in Colesville, Maryland, so we're just a few miles up the road, and our mission is really about preserving and sharing the history of electric streetcars and trolleys in the Washington, D.C. area. So our museum houses an extensive collection of streetcars from around the world, but we also have a number of streetcars from the Washington area. And we also operate a demonstration railway so that you can come out and ride on some of these historic cars. One of the cars that we have in our collection is Capital Traction car number 27. It used to be car number 766 when it operated with DC Transit, but it has historical significance in that it was the last streetcar to operate in Washington in January of 1962, but it was also one of the cars that used to operate to Chevy Chase and to Kensington. So I encourage you to come out and take a look at it. It is undergoing restoration right now, so we've been doing a restoration on it for the last few years, but hopefully we can bring it over into our display barn, but it is one of the cars that used to operate on the Connecticut Avenue line. And so our museum serves as a valuable resource for both transportation enthusiasts and also for local history lovers. In addition to our collection, we provide a wealth of educational materials and also host events and participate in events that celebrate the history of streetcars in the DC area. Because of the work that we've been doing in the archives in the library, we've really been wanting to go out to the communities and just kind of let people know that, one, that we're here. We've been in the museum since, we've been in Northwest Branch Park since 1969, but to also let them know that you can experience the museum in different ways. So if you aren't able to make it out to the museum, whenever possible, we like to come out to you. So that's one of the things that we're doing tonight. And so our mission really is about educating the public and also preserving these iconic vehicles and also kind of telling the story of how the streetcar helped to kind of shape communities in the first part of the 20th century. For those of you that are interested in the history of Kensington and its trolley system, the museum offers a more deeper understanding of how transportation systems influenced local communities, including Kensington, and also its transformation into the thriving community that we know it today. So, to begin this presentation, I'm actually going to start talking about the Baltimore and Ohio and the Metropolitan Branch. So this was kind of one of the earliest transportation links to the Kensington community. It was, as we describe it here, the gateway to Washington's growing suburbs. And the reason that this was built was that it was constructed in the late 1860s and early 1970s, so immediately following the Civil War. And this was an attempt to kind of take advantage of the connect the cities of Washington to many of the cities that are out west. So the Metropolitan Branch operates from Washington, D.C. and Union Station that we know today, all the way out to Point of Rocks. And this was a decision that was to construct the branch line was driven by a combination of factors, including the growing demand for better transportation, infrastructure as the region's population and economy expanded, and the Met also provided a more direct and efficient route between Washington, D.C. and points west. And so it was also in a way for the Baltimore and Ohio to establish itself as a kind of predominant or dominant railway in the mid-Atlantic region. Oh, hold on one second. Okay, just saying okay to something. And so the The Met itself, this is a map of the metropolitan branch coming up from Washington, D.C., and you can see the communities that were served by it, operating up through Brookland, Tacoma Park, Silver Spring, Kensington, Garrett Park, and then on to Rockville. And one of the things that I always find interesting when I look at older maps is how many places are still served by transit today. And so we can see from the map that, well, obviously Washington, D.C., but Brookland, Tacoma, and Silver Spring are all part of today's Red Line. And we can recognize those stops. And then, of course, Kensington, Garrett Park, and Rockville are still served today by MARC commuter rail. And so when you establish a transit pattern, it's very important to see kind of where that pattern originated and how valuable that pattern was, because in some cases, the pattern still exists. And the importance of the B&O and the Metropolitan Branch was that it served a vital transportation link between these communities and also connected these communities to the Washington Metropolitan, to the city of Washington, but also provided a means of transportation for people to go out of these communities, because now areas like Kensington are connected so that you can catch a train at any time of the day and come into the city and then come out in the evenings, much the same way that people do today. But it was also a way to kind of encourage a more suburban lifestyle. So whereas Kensington, up until the B&O arrived, may have been considered more of a rural community, now you've got this link to the larger city. And so now people can live in Kensington, and then they don't have to necessarily be farmers or anything, but they can work in the city and then have their suburb and have their quality of life in the suburbs with, you know, a quiet home outside of the city, with land and places around where you can live and have some space and quiet. But what this also did was it also began to set the stage for the introduction of streetcars and electric trolleys to like the Kensington Railway. So one thing I wanted to kind of stop and talk about was the Pendleton Act, Civil Service Act of 1883, and why this was so important in the creation of Kensington and why the streetcar was so important with this. But this was an act that was a significant piece of legislation that aimed to reform the federal government's civil service system. And prior to this act, government jobs were typically handed out by either nepotism or who you knew. And so this was an attempt to introduce a merit system into the federal hiring practice. And so this way, that prior to the, so what it did was it established that federal positions should be awarded based on merit rather than political connections. And of course, I wanted to include this slide because it's kind of relevant today, not to be political or anything, but we see what is going on in the federal government at this time, but we also see that the Pendleton Act goes back to the 19th century. And so many of us, I was a Fed, and so there was this process that you went through where you went in, and depending on what your position was, you either took a test or you were interviewed, but it was based on your qualifications. And what that did was it kind of helped establish this federal working class that would live in and around the Washington, D.C. area. So you start to stabilize the employment where you've got federal employees. As my dad would say, you have a good government job, and that gives you a certain level that you're going to get a paycheck every 2 weeks. You know that there are certain places where you can go where they see that you're working for the federal government that may get you access to money or to a loan where you can buy a home or a car. So it offers up a sense of stability. And so if you look at the Pendleton Act as one of the underpinnings of a middle class or suburban lifestyle, that's why this was so important, and also passing at around the same time that the Metropolitan Branch is opening. So you start to see that in and around Washington, you've got a railroad that can take you to and from Kensington every day and the bedroom communities, but you've also got this standard of living that's kind of guaranteed by working for the federal government that ensures that you can do things like own a home or send your children to school, and so it's kind of sets the bar there. And so as a result, Kensington, Maryland, with its proximity to Washington, became an increasingly attractive place for federal workers, and that's one way that the Pendleton Act helped. And so going back one slide, sorry. And so we talked about the merit-based hiring, but also just kind of looking at how these communities were developed. When I was starting to do my research about Kensington, I see that it goes back into the 17th century with some of the early settlers, and I didn't want to go back that far just because I'm on a bit of a time constraint. But I did want to kind of show that here's one of the maps for Kensington that would have been used as probably a promotional map to encourage people to buy homes in this area. And so what immediately struck me was that this very much is a community with a sort of a planned street system. There was some thought given to how the name was selected. So what does the name of Kensington want to convey to prospective homeowners? And so looking at this and then seeing that much of this street system still exists, so you can still find this on a map today, kind of lends to kind of the importance of why setting up a community like this was so important and why it would have been so appealing to new residents or people that were living in the area. All right. And so this, you start to see the beginnings of the suburbs with the rising affluence of people making more money, a growing urbanization as the city of Washington itself is starting to grow, in part because streetcars are now pushing the boundaries of the city farther out. So older communities, like if you're living in the district like LaDroit Park or anywhere of the communities up along Florida Avenue or Boundary Street, which were once the original suburbs, because they were within walking distance of downtown, now you're pushing that boundary farther up. So now you're going up the hill into places like Mount Pleasant, up along Georgia Avenue into Brightwood, but then you're also pushing farther out into the suburbs with the advent of the electric streetcar in the late 1800s and 1890s. So now you can go as far as the trolley line will take you, and it also is improving transportation options. One of the things that we also looked at, or that I looked at in my research, was also kind of the road conditions of the time and how the streetcar or the railroad were a much more reliable option because many of the roads were unpaved or unimproved. So being able to get on something that you knew was going to show up at a certain time every day made living farther out a little bit more realistic because now you can get to work and not expect to be late. So the Pendleton Act and the resulting growth of the federal workforce played a key role in shaping the demand for suburban living, particularly among seeking a quiet residential lifestyle outside of Washington, D.C. With the rise of this new and burgeoning middle class, areas like Kensington began to attract more residents, but at the same time, developers were starting to recognize the opportunity to create communities tailored to these federal employees, and one of the most significant developments was the creation of Chevy Chase. This was spearheaded by Francis Newlands and the Chevy Chase Land Company, which still exists today. But this was the creation of another planned community. But part of the selling point of Chevy Chase was that you would access it on this new technology, this electric streetcar that would whisk you up from the downtown area in a matter of minutes. And I think over on the far table, if you look at the large panel that has all the pictures on it, there is a little green card on there that's a running card from 1924, but it was for all of the operators for all the different lines, and it would tell you, for the operators and the motormen, how many minutes it would take them to get from their terminus downtown to the end of the line. And I think for Chevy Chase, I think they gave it about 45 minutes. So I don't know if you can get from downtown to Chevy Chase in 45 minutes today at 5 o'clock. But it would be nice if you could. But it was the beginnings of this that you see the Chevy Chase line and the Rock Creek Railway, and that the railway provided a vital transportation link between the community and the heart of the capital, and makes the area even more attractive to federal workers that needed a quick access to the city. And so with this this transportation infrastructure, it helped establish one of the most sought-after suburbs in the area, and it also, for those that were employed by the federal government, but it also helped shape further suburban growth for the region. And so with the creation of Chevy Chase, now you have this community that has, suburban developments. So you can have this kind of lifestyle where you can live outside of the city, and you don't have to worry about the noise and the pollution and what was described as some of the unfortunate influences of the city, because this is also at a time where you have a lot of migration coming into Washington and cities in general. So you have a lot of people of color that are moving into the cities. You have ethnic minorities that are moving into the cities. And so in some ways, moving out into the suburbs was a way to kind of ensure that you kind of kept, if you didn't want your children around certain elements, this is something that we do talk about, was that this was one of the ways that communities would develop, and they would move out and separate from the rest of the city. So only certain people had to come in every day. So you didn't have to worry about being subjected to all of the vice and things that cities were starting to become known for. And so as the success of the Rock Creek Railway and Chevy Chase community continued to drive suburban development, there was a growing need to provide residents of nearby areas like Kensington with better access to Washington. This was, of course, after you've already got the B&O Railroad, but now you've got this electric streetcar service that only operated as far north as Chevy Chase Lake. So you're still about 2.5 miles away from Kensington. So this was an attempt with the establishment of the Chevy Chase Lake and Kensington Railway to bridge and to provide another transportation option for the residents of Kensington, because now you've got this streetcar line that will start up here, actually right at the B&O station, essentially, and operate down to connect up with the Chevy Chase Lake streetcar, where you would change cars and then ride on into downtown Washington. And so the image that was on the beginning of the presentation was one of the Kensington cars that had pulled into Chevy Chase Lake and then was switching ends to do the run back up to Kensington. But this was created. The company was established in 1894. And it only operated for a few years. The quote that I have here, "A rollicking route through the woods," was a quote that I read from John Merrican, who was a former member of the Trolley Museum and a writer of a number of books, particularly about the Washington, Baltimore, and Annapolis. But he did write a chapter in another publication about the history of the Kensington Railway, and this is how he described the ride at the time, as a rollicking ride through the woods. And we'll get into why that was a little bit later. But the company was established in 1894, and it offered residents of Kensington a more direct route to Washington, D.C., and so now they can access this area and also take advantage of some of the attractions and some of the conveniences that were down in the Chevy Chase community. One aspect, and I don't know if we put the photo out, but we have one blueprint that shows the Chevy Chase Lake Amusement Park, which was down at the end of the trolley line. And that was a huge draw for people coming up from the city, but it was also a way for people to come down from Kensington and have some enjoyment and amusement that was close by. And so the Kensington Railway, the Chevy Chase Lake and Kensington Railway only ran for a couple of years. In the original plans, the railway had ambitions to extend north to Olney, Sandy Spring, and Wheaton, and actually go all the way up to Ellicott City. That was a very ambitious plan. Unfortunately, it only made it as far as Norris Station before financial situation prevented the line from going any further. So by 1902, the line itself was in receivership, and so, but these were some of the benefits of the line initially. So it improved the transportation access, boosted suburban development, but also supported local commerce and recreation. And so in 1902, the company was in receivership, and it was purchased and renamed as the Kensington Railway, and this would be the name that it would carry up until the end of service. But this was a quote that I found in one of the newspaper articles describing the line itself and kind of what it did as a means of fostering and cultivating community support or community spirit. And so the line itself started in 1902, and this marked a turning point with the assets being acquired and renamed. And so under the new management, the Kensington Railway was able to stabilize its operations and make some key investments, including acquiring additional rolling stock. The car that you see here is a little six-wheeler single truck car that was referred to as the Dinky. And that term is kind of a transit industry term that was used to describe small little streetcars that used to operate either as shuttles or carry a very few number of people. So I've seen that term used over and over again in other places. But with these improvements, the Kensington Railway was able to expand its reach, and so it actually had two extensions, at least for a little bit. It went up to just beyond the B&O station, and it actually crossed the B&O tracks on a small trestle, and then it served the African-American community of Kengar, and then finally ending up at Norris Station. So all told, I think the entire alignment from Chevy Chase Lake all the way up to Norris Station was about 3 to 3.5 miles total. And so this was the line, and this was what the line would remain until the end of streetcar service. It reached reached West Kensington by 1915, and then Norris Station by 1916. And so these extensions allowed the railway to serve a slightly larger population. But the Kensington Railway itself was always under a bit of financial strain because it was low ridership, because of it was a small community at the time. And so with that, you've got, let's see, hold on. All right. So you've got this growth of Connecticut, of Kensington, as what was referred to as the Pasadena of the suburbs. Again, I found out we have a lot of newspaper articles, and I love the way that they write in newspapers because they're very flowery language. But this was used to describe the community itself, and there was a comment, that was a quote that was made about the line itself, and so they were talking about the importance of living in Kensington and what a great community it was and how convenient it was being served by both the railroad and the electric street railway, and that the residents of the community were very progressive. They hailed from almost all of 50 states, but primarily Marylanders. They were very industrious people, and that the mayor was a very intelligent man who was working with and trying to solve many of the problems identified with suburbs. And at the very end of the article, it said, including improving Maryland's awful roads. And I thought that was interesting because one, wherever you live, I think, you always complain about the traffic and the roads and things like that. But understanding the importance of why having access to roads and streetcars and railroads was so important, because you've got residential, a necessity for residents to live here. You've got the commerce that needs to come in and out and trade, but also just a general sense of feeling connected to the outside world. And so, hold on. What I'm about to introduce next is a short interview clip from a former Kensington resident, Mary Hall, who passed away, I believe, in 1980. But in 1975, she gave an interview, and she talks about growing up in Kensington and riding the streetcars. And so this was actually recorded on April 28th, 1975, so it's almost 50 years ago. But this is just a short clip, so hopefully I can turn this up so you can hear it. Is
about 6 windows on each side, and seats running.
Do you know what the speaker is?
In between was one known as the jumping Jenny, because alas, as soon as you saw it coming down the track, you wondered whether you'd get to town. It often failed to negotiate a curve and jump the track as you walked either forward or backward, depending on your inclination and impetus. The third one was called the cheese box. Not that we see the resemblance now, but at the time it resembled those square, rectangular wooden boxes of cheese that you could buy now. I guess they're plastic wrapped, but anyway, we called it the cheese box. It too was a fearful and wonderful affair, and owned by a fearful and wonderful person. We called him Old Man Phillips. This particular car was the elegant one. It had regular side seats, which could be shifted over at the end of the line so people wouldn't have to ride backwards.
So that was just a short clip from that interview, but I wanted to include that one because it's always great to hear a first-person narrative from someone who is actually there and who remembers writing these and remembers describing this. And she goes on to talk about going to school, because I guess in Kensington at the time, when you advanced to, I think, high school or something, you had to go to school in the district, and the district would allow Kensington residents their children to attend school for free I believe if they worked for the federal government. But there was some reciprocity there. But she talks about riding the streetcar to go to school. But then she also talks about the school here in Kensington and that, having the one-room school with an inkwell in the desk, and then the orange tree out in the back that you used to throw they used to throw oranges at each other when they were kids. So it's a much longer interview, and we have a transcript of it, but I wanted to include this because she talks about what it was like to ride the streetcar and wondering whether the streetcar would show up or if it would stay on the track. The thing about the line itself was that until the Capital Traction Company took over service in the 20s, the line itself was fairly informal. So there weren't necessarily designated stops or anything like that. It was typically you would kind of hail the car, and it was the car was either down the line or up the line. So it was either heading down towards Chevy Chase or it was heading up towards Kensington. So you had to kind of plan your schedule accordingly. There's also they talk about where the different operators, a lot of them lived in the community, and so they knew their neighbors, and so if Mrs. Jones needed to run into the bank, they would hold the car for her while she ran into the bank to cash a check and then hop on. Or if someone needed to, we were looking at some of the fare information, and it said, I think it would charge you 10 cents if you wanted to carry any freight, milk, or dogs on the front platform of the trolley for an extra fare. So there was a very kind of familial nature about the line itself, which kind of lends itself to it being called, either the Dinky or the Jumping Jenny or the Cheese Box. But I thought that was a great thing to add there. And so, we talked about the expansion of the line going up to West Kensington and on to Norris Station. And for a while, it looked like it was the ridership and the revenue was fairly stable. But what was happening during this time was, if you look at Connecticut Avenue at this time, these are images of Connecticut Avenue coming up through Chevy Chase at the turn of the last century. And you can see in some images, you can see where the car line is located either off to the side on one, depending on which photo you're looking at. But the condition of Connecticut Avenue itself could be kind of unpredictable depending on if you have bad weather, if it's raining, or if it's snow. And so the trolley line, and if you look at it in comparison to the road itself, the trolley line did look a little bit more reliable in that the track was relatively level and straight. You can see this is a wagon over here on the side, so they may be taking some goods to market or somewhere down along the community. But then you can also see just how sparsely populated Chevy Chase and this area of Montgomery County was at the turn of the last century, and how a streetcar coming up into this area would kind of facilitate the growth of development and residential areas. And so one of the things that came as a result of this was the Good Roads movement. And this kind of has its roots back in the late 1800s, but it was an attempt to improve public roads in the United States. And in Maryland in 1904, the Shoemaker Act was passed, which was part of this Good Roads movement. But what the state of Maryland did was it allocated, I think it was $200,000 to different counties around the state to make road improvements. And so the blueprint that is down here, that's part of this image down here, is, we actually have it up here, is actually a paving plan that was done in 1911 for Connecticut Avenue going from Chevy Chase Circle up to Bradley, Bradley Boulevard now. But what was interesting about the graphic and why I wanted to include it is that the names that were written in between in the roadway were all of the companies that had something to do with the project. So at the far end, you'll see the Texas Company, which we know today as Texaco. You come back one, you see Standard Oil Company, and then you also see the Good Roads Improvement Company. So you start seeing all of these paving companies and petroleum companies that were kind of supporting these efforts to improve roads throughout the state of Maryland and in other places, and that this would eventually have a negative impact on streetcars, because now if the road that the streetcar is running next to is paved, then you don't have to worry about riding the streetcar if the weather is bad. Or if the road is paved and you've just acquired a new Model T or something like that, now you can come and go when you please and you don't have to wait for a streetcar. So a lot of this would come back to affect streetcar operations in both in the DC area, but around the country later. And so by the 1920s, the Capital Traction Company was one of two streetcar companies that were operating in Washington. The other one was the Washington Railway and Electric Company. But between 1923 and 1933, the Capital Traction Company would assume operation of the Kensington Railway. And the quote was that you're now getting the big shiny cars from the big city. And so what that meant was that at the time, by the 1920s, the Kensington line itself had fallen into disrepair, as was described as a miserable travesty. But the rolling stock was old, the right-of-way needed improvements, and so the residents of Kensington petitioned the Capital Traction Company to assume operation of the trolley line. And so Capital Traction told Kensington residents that if you can raise $13,500 to make the necessary improvements along the right-of-way, then we will assume operation of the streetcar line. And so residents of Kensington raised $13,500, and this was to make improvements to the line. They strengthened the bridge that went over Rock Creek, because the Capital Traction was going to start operating these bigger, heavier cars, cheese boxes, up from the city. And so in November of 1923, the Kensington Railway streetcar ceased to operate as its own kind of separate entity. And the cars that had operated on the Kensington Railway were what we refer to as dead line. They would just run out to the end of the line and just left there. And so that's where they remained for a number of years, and they became, targets for rocks and things like that until, they kind of were just fallen away and then scrapped. But 1923 to 1933, the company is operating streetcars up all the way up. So now residents in Kensington no longer have to make a transfer at Chevy Chase Lake. They can get on a streetcar in Kensington and ride all the way into downtown, a one-seat ride for, I think it was about 7 cents at the time, or around 7 cents. So that also was an improvement. But this would all go until about 1933, when the Washington Railway and Electric and Capital Traction merged to form Capital Transit. And so their kind of motto and their theme was more greater efficiency and economy of management. And for me being involved with the museum, I've seen this because if you look back at the history of streetcars in Washington and all the different types of cars that Washington used to operate, many of those cars are gone. And so what we have at the Trolley Museum is a very, very, very small collection or a sample of the types of cars that used to operate. So when Capital Transit assumed operation, you had all of these different types of cars that used to operate, but the company was really moving towards trying to standardize its fleet and have a very kind of simple, maintenance practices. And so a number of these cars were scrapped in the 30s, so 33, 34, 35, 36, right up until World War II. And so the company itself, and this is a clip of Washington in the 30s, so you can see the Mayflower Hotel. But this was the kind of the environment that the city was in and that residents were in at this point. So, the two companies were merging because they were both kind of struggling financially. Even with the Depression and the new alphabet cities that were coming in, it was still expensive to operate streetcars in the city. So they were looking for ways to kind of make the operation more efficient and consolidate and kind of eliminate any redundancies. But kind of looking at, this is, Pennsylvania Avenue in the 1930s, and what you're seeing are some of the beginnings of some of the more modern equipment that the Capital Transit Company would start to operate. This car that's up in front is a 1000, which was introduced in 1935, and then right behind it, you can see a PCC or a streamline car turning onto 14th Street. And so what Capital Transit was about was being as modern as possible, providing reliable service, and also kind of understanding that this is a city at the time that most of the people were coming into Washington either on a streetcar or a bus. So they were also looking at ways to make this operation more efficient. And one of the things that came out of this was the Beeler Report. And we've got a copy of the Beeler Report right here. And so this was a report that was done in 1934, and it was done by the Capital Transit Company and then presented to the Public Utilities Commission. And in it, it had three recommendations. One, it wanted to secure improved service, but it also had a plan for rerouting streetcars and also for bus recommendations. So when the two companies merged, there was a lot of redundant trackage in the system. And so one of the things that the Beeler Report was trying to address is ways that they could eliminate some of the redundant trackage, but it was also looking at the number of streetcars that were coming into and out of Washington, the downtown core, every day. And I think at one point, somewhere in the report, it talks about almost 700 plus streetcars coming into the core every day. And so wherever possible, they were looking for recommendations to frankly, eliminate service that wasn't needed, or at least that wasn't seen as a high priority in terms of ridership numbers. And so I think it's recommendation number 6 in the report. It's open to the page. But the recommendation was for eliminating streetcar service in up to Chevy Chase. So in 1933, streetcar service to Kensington ends. So now you've got no more streetcar service to Kensington, you're taking a bus. But for 2 more years, you've still got the Chevy Chase Lake streetcar line that's still operating. The Beeler Report makes a recommendation to end that service. It also makes a recommendation to end streetcar service going out to Rockville from Friendship Heights. So based off of that recommendation, in 1935, September of 1935, if you're a rail fan in this area, September of 1935 was a very sad time because what you had was the end of streetcar service on Connecticut Avenue. You had the end of streetcar service on the Rockville line. You also had the end of the WB&A, the Washington, Baltimore, and Annapolis interurban service between Washington and Baltimore. And so this maybe didn't register quite at the time because there were still plenty of streetcars operating in the area, but looking at it in hindsight, you can start to see the beginnings of the end of streetcar service altogether, even though it's going back to the 30s. We always think about streetcar service ending kind of in the 40s after World War II and into the 50s, but really it started to go, at least in some part, in the 1930s. And so 1930s, they're introducing the Chevy Chase coach line. So this is providing service up Connecticut Avenue, up to Chevy Chase Lake, and up to service onto Kensington. I think one of the features of the service was that there was a smoking section. So didn't know if it was that serious, but okay. And then finally on September 15th, 1935, all streetcar service ends along Connecticut Avenue. And so the bus service is put in. They maintain the existing fare schedule, so you're still paying 7 cents. But this really was the end, and so I think it's 8401, or right at Connecticut Avenue, right where the Purple Line crosses. That was where the barn was for the Chevy Chase division. And so after 1935, the barn is abandoned, and I think it became a furniture store at some point later, and then the building was torn down. Up here on the front, we have a small photo album. I encourage you to come and look at it, but it's taken, I think these were photos that were from the Bob Truax collection, but they are photographs of the operating crews, the motormen and conductors that worked at Chevy Chase in 1935. And the great thing about it is that their names are all in there. So you can actually go through and see everybody's names, and they're very informal shots. So they're not the company, this was not a company photo. These are guys kind of hanging around at the end of their shifts. Some of them have nicknames. I think one of them is, I forgot what it's called, Speed Rail or something like that. So it's very informal, but there was something about that community and the people that worked there and what this line meant to so many people. And so the swell guys we know. This was taken from a kind of a yearbook, if you will, that was put out by Capital Transit in 1947, but I like the title. But it just kind of shows just kind of how important the people that worked for the company were to the community, because they were a part of the community. And so when you look back and looking at kind of studying how the streetcar came to Kensington and the community of Kensington and why this place was so important, it's really about getting to know the people that lived there. And so looking at the names, and we were trying to figure out if maybe some of the descendants of these people may still live in the Kensington area or maybe live in the Chevy Chase area. But I mean, these were the money that you made from this. You weren't going to get rich being a streetcar motorman, but you could afford a lifestyle. You could have a house, you could have a family, you could do all of these things. And the one other thing I'll point out is we have the Timekeeper's book from Capital Transit from 1935, from April, and in it has the listings of the employees. This was from the M Street shops down at 3222 M Street, but it showed how much these people made per hour. They were making 35, 40, 45 cents an hour, working 10 hours a day, 5, 6 days a week. And from that, they were able to, have a lifestyle and raise a family. And so there was a certain upward mobility to working in the transit industry. Like I said, you weren't going to get rich from it, but there was a certain level of stability that came with that. And so I think this is coming up on the almost the last slide. The last slide that I have is a final clip, and this was an interview between Carol James, who was a local radio personality in the Washington area, and Al Savage, who was a member of our trolley museum. This was made in 1997, and Mr. Savage grew up in Washington. He grew up in the area. He went to work for Capital Transit in 1938, and he later became a vice president of DC Transit, which would take over operation of streetcars and buses in the 50s. And I think he even went on and worked for Metro for a while. But here, it's just a short clip, but it talks about why the relationship between the streetcar and Kensington. So I'll set the microphone down this time. Let's see. These were just some more of the images from the photo book here, but you can see, very informal. But these were people that saw each other every day, and so these were your coworkers and your work family and that sort of thing. So, I really like this because it kind of shows them at ease, if you will. They're not posing for anyone particular. They're among friends. So let me see if I can play this clip here.
Washington's one of the most beautiful cities in the world, and so I guess a trolley ride in Washington was pretty special.
Yes, there were several especially nice ones. One would be out the Connecticut Avenue all the way out to Kensington, where there was an ice cream factory, so to speak, called McKeever's, where the B&O Railroad was. People used to ride out there, eat ice cream, and ride back in, and they had open trolleys on Connecticut Avenue at that time, and it was very enjoyable.
And so that concludes my presentation. So I'd like to thank you for coming out this evening, and thank you for for enduring through the technical difficulties. I think we're going to do a Q&A, and then after that, like I said earlier, I'd like to invite you up to take a look at some of the objects that we brought over from the museum. And I would like to thank you all for inviting me out tonight, so thank you.
So what I'm going to do, if you let me know if you have a question, I'll come around with the microphone so we capture it for our recording. All the way over at the other end. Give me a break.
So my name is Kevin. I am involved with the Rock Creek Conservancy, and we do cleanups at Kensington Parkway and Rock and Beach Drive, and I've done them for 10 or 15 years. And we've always noticed the piers, which appear right there off of Kensington Parkway. Are those the bridge you refer to? And is that the only existing memorial for this line?
Yes, so if the bridge piers are for the railway that used to come across Rock Creek, and so that's kind of what's left there. From what I can tell, there's not much else left. The photos up here if you take a look at them, by 1937, the nature had pretty much reclaimed the railway. Okay, and so when you look at the photographs, I think they taken up the ties and they taken up the rail and pulled down the overhead wire and the poles, and so everything just kind of grew back in. And then the other photo there's a photo that shows the line coming into Chevy Chase Lake, where it would cross the B&O spur and the Georgetown branch, and then but if you look behind it, Connecticut Avenue north of the B&O was a 2-lane road. And then once you got on the other side of it, it widened out to 6 lanes with the trolley line running down the middle of it. Well, of course, if you look north of there now, all of that's been widened so much, so there's nothing left of the Kensington line there. And that's kind of an unfortunate thing about the line itself, because it was this kind of small rural trolley line. So when it went, nature reclaimed it and took most of it back. So if you look probably really closely, you might be able to find some of the right-of-way, but I mean, trees have probably grown in and everything, so it's probably hard. But the bridge piers are probably the only thing that's left.
One of my dreams is to have like an interpretive panel while you cross the bridge there. You could have some of these pictures.
Yeah, I mean, the photos were great. I love looking at photos. I mean, Chris will come into my office and he'll say, "What do you think this is?" And then we will spend 20 minutes trying to figure out what this image is, just so we can tell people what it is. So yeah, it's a lot of fun though.
Questions?
Any other questions?
So was the Kensington line north of Chevy Chase Lake a single track?
Yeah, so it was a single track. That's in the reference to either the trolley is up the line or down the line. Coming in, there was a case that I saw back in 1911 where I think the Ray family, they had sold off a portion of their land, which was just south of here, so that the Kensington Railway could be built on that. And there was, I think there was the company wanted to build some sidings along there, but the original agreement was that it was just supposed to be a single track, so they wouldn't let them add a siding there. But I don't think, Chris, if the line ever went double track anywhere along the alignment? It was just single? So it was a single track, and so if you missed the car, you had to wait for it to come all the way back up and then go back down again.
We've got some Zoom questions.
Okay.
Assuming I can read Patty's handwriting. How exactly did the electricity run the cars with no overhead lines?
Well, it did have overhead lines.
Okay.
And so at the car barn at Chevy Chase Lake, there was also a power station at Chevy Chase Lake. And so that was where the power came from. It was a generating station that would generate the electric power for the overhead wire for the Chevy Chase Lake, for the Chevy Chase line and the Kensington line. And we have a piece of that hardware at the museum in Streetcar Hall. It's called an exciter, and it's just this large kind of generating wheel that looks like it would hook in, and I think it was off of steam or something that came off of the B&O, because they would provide coal, because that's why the car barn was built right there, so they could get the coal from the Georgetown branch that would power the substation that would run the power. And then there were also substations that would have been located along that would keep the voltage up at a certain voltage so that the power didn't dip as it got farther from the generating station.
What were the safety records like with all that electricity running around?
Well, it was a safe operation. I mean, I think probably the major thing would have been a derailment of sorts, but this was at a time where you didn't have, the National Transportation Safety Board and things like that. So a lot of times when you read accounts, and I've talked to, when I first joined the museum, there were still a few people around who had operated streetcars in Washington, and they would often say, if you derailed somewhere, you kind of just backed the car back on and just went on your way, unless it was really bad. and you had to bring in a wrecker truck. But the power station itself was, I don't ever recall reading of any incidents where there were any accidents or anything like that.
Another Zoom question. Where did the Rock Creek Railroad tracking go? Was it on the B&O line?
The Rock Creek Railway itself, the alignment was starting at Chevy Chase Lake as a circle. It was just a loop. So if you're going up if you're going up Connecticut Avenue now, if you're heading north, if you think about on the right, you've got Chevy Chase Lake Drive that goes off to the right, but then right in front of where the car barn was, there was a loop, so it would swing out to the right towards the car barn, swing back across Connecticut Avenue, and then there would be a waiting station on the west side of Connecticut Avenue, and that was where the car would pull up and board passengers. And so from there, it would operate south along Connecticut Avenue, down into the district, coming around Chevy Chase Circle, all the way down Connecticut Avenue through, Van Ness and Cleveland Park and Woodley Park. And then at Calvert Street, it would make a left turn and turn into what is now the Duke Ellington Bridge, and then go across into the Adams Morgan and go down through Adams Morgan, down to U Street, where it'd make a left and go on to U Street to 14th Street, and then would head down 14th Street, and then, and then it would make a right turn at New York Avenue downtown and head back towards Potomac Park. That was one variation of the route. So it never used the B&O line. It was its own right-of-way. But there was also a 7th Street variation of that, too, so I won't get into all that.
Okay. Couple of thoughts. We got question back up there. You're going to meet me in the middle, Tracy? This is our Mayor, Tracy.
So not too long ago, the district tried to get streetcars back on the streets. Do you know if they're still running?
Yes, they are.
Oh, okay. So they're being successful?
Yes, they've been running. I think they're coming up on 9 years now. But that was a project I used to work on. So when I was at DDOT, I used to work on the planning for the streetcar. I was in Baltimore on the day the cars were offloaded out at Dundalk and at the shipping terminal, and so and we've had DC Streetcar actually came out to the Trolley Museum just in January for DC Transit Day. So they brought a lot of their swag and stuff, and I think the line is still running, and I think they're still talking about extending the line east across the river. There's still talks about that too.
Okay. Do you know, last question, do you know why it took so long to get the tracks out of Georgetown? I remember as a kid going to Georgetown, and you could always see the railroad tracks in the middle of the road down there.
Well, I think when streetcar service ended, the original plan was for DC Transit was supposed to physically dig out all of the conduit track in the city, and of course that would be extremely expensive, and so they reached an agreement where we'll put a metal strip or something over the slot rail so the asphalt doesn't fall into it and just pave over the rest. And so in Georgetown, I've heard different stories that the residents didn't want the tracks removed, but there was some reason that those tracks remained. But of course, I moved to Washington in 1997, and so by that point, O&P Street had settled below the top of the rails. So if you were driving your car, you could, blow a tire, if it came off on the side. And so, but by that point, they'd become historic. And so now they're really not going to take them out. And so the DC Department of Transportation worked with the community, and they did the whole rebuild. So they rebuilt O&P Street, and then they rebuilt a lot of the track infrastructure underneath. So little technical segue here. Washington, D.C., the streetcar system in Washington operated on a conduit system. So when the Chevy Chase cars would get down and go across the bridge across Rock Creek, they would stop there, and there would be an underground vault where they would lower the trolley pole, and they would put a conduit plow that would hang off the bottom of the streetcar, and then the car would operate on into the city, collecting the power from underneath the street. And the tracks sit on these large cast iron yokes that are placed about every 5 or 6 feet. And so in Georgetown, over time, a lot of those yokes had broken. And they broke and they settled. And so what DDOT did was they actually would have to dig all of that out, fill in where the yokes were no longer viable, and then relay some of the yokes that were still there. And so I actually have in my home about a 1.5 foot section of track from the Glen Echo line in my apartment that I lobbied hard for because I wanted it, and they cut it and set it aside for me. But that's how the tracks got saved in Georgetown. I know it's a long story, but yeah, that's how they got saved.
Thanks. You had a question?
Yeah, thank you so much, Eric. I've been to the Trolley Museum. Just want to give it a big shout out several times.
Thank you.
It's fabulous. I actually had 2 questions. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the movement to buses, like just elaborate on like how and why that happened. And then I'm curious about, it seemed through the pictures and from what you said a little bit that it was the trolley portions were fairly segregated. I don't know if that was naturally because the people that were riding them, lived in certain areas, or was that more deliberate? Do you have kind of history on that part of it?
So I'll do the segregation part first. So because we're often asked this question of whether streetcars in Washington were segregated, at least by law, and the answer is no. So going back to 1864, so each company that would operate streetcars had to get a charter from Congress. And so they would write in the charter all the conditions that the company would operate, the fares, the type, how often the cars would run. But in the 1864 charter for the Metropolitan Railway, which was the second street railway to be chartered in the city, it wrote in there that the company could not discriminate based on race for passengers. Now that didn't mean that people didn't segregate by custom, but at least on, through all of the mergers and things for the company, when you see they did not segregate by law at least. Now, the company itself did have segregated jobs, so African American men would do certain jobs, and we didn't bring it with us this time, but one of the jobs was the pitman. So I think on this, in the timekeeper's book up here, you'll see listings for pitmen. These were the men that were down in the pits all day putting streetcar plows on or taking them off. And one of the records that we came across was sometime in the early, I think, late teens or early 20s, one of the plow pits finally got a toilet installed. So if you can imagine working under these conditions in the street, you're just in the street without this. So that was one thing. And then we also came across the building plans for the Eastern Car House on East Capitol Street. And it was a plan for rebuilding what was then called the Colored Men's Locker Room in 1947. So the company did have its practices and its jobs and things were segregated, even though, I as a person of color could have gotten on a streetcar, presumably, and sat anywhere I wanted, at least, and not have been arrested, presumably, but, not by custom. And then your other question about the buses, the transition to buses, was that really kind of after World War I, you've got enough technological improvements in engines and tires and things that you start seeing buses to start making inroads. And what happens is that they start with kind of the far out lines, if you think of like a tree, kind of the far out branches of the lines, and they start putting buses on these little lines because the streetcar line is not making any money. So they just said, well, you know what, we'll substitute buses for this. That way we don't have to pay for the road that we operate on, because often in these agreements, the traction companies would have to pay to use the public road. They would be responsible for maintaining their portion of the public road. They would have to pay for any infrastructure improvements, even if, motors and things. So if you're running a bus on that, you don't pay for any of that. You're not paying for substations, you're not paying for overhead wire or any of that. And so beginning in the 20s, you start seeing buses start making inroads on these kind of far out portions of the system. And then by the 1930s, the technology's improved enough that now you can run a bus that's only run with one person, because streetcars at this time were operated by a motorman and a conductor. So now you've got a labor savings, you've got a financial savings that you're not paying for the infrastructure, and you're providing essentially the same service. At least on the books, it looks like the same service. So if your job is just to run transit, does it matter if it's being provided with a streetcar or with a bus? And so that trend would continue all the way through the 30s and 40s and then into the 50s. And then by the 50s, you've got buses with air conditioning. So you've got another feature that a lot of streetcars didn't have. Streetcars didn't have air conditioning. We had one, the Silver Sightseer, which was a Washington, D.C. streetcar. It was the only air-conditioned streetcar, at the time. But that would have been a considerable cost if D.C. Transit decided that they wanted to upgrade all of their streetcars to air conditioning. So that's kind of why buses ended up taking over.
Thank you. Now, we're going to take a last couple questions off the Zoom group. But just so you know, we've got another 40 people on Zoom. So we've got a nice group out there on Zoom.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Now, if you know this, I'm going to be highly impressed. What was the color scheme on the Kensington Railway cars?
So if we go back, so if we're looking at,
And he knows it.
let me
Yeah.
back up. On the Jumping Jenny, number 2, the one that was in the middle, I believe the color was maroon and cream originally, and then the colors would change later, but it was maroon and cream for the Kensington Electric Railway, and then after that, with capital traction, the colors went to like just the larger cars were just a kind of a dark Pullman-ish green color.
How long did the ride from Kensington to downtown take? Now, you said Chevy Chase was about 45 minutes to downtown, so another 10 or 15 from here?
Probably about another 10 to 15. So you're figuring probably about an hour
Okay.
from if you're up here riding all the way downtown to Potomac Park.
Cool. I will say on behalf of the Zoom people, great presentation, thank you very much. So they are actively engaged there on Zoom. Couple thoughts. I didn't mention at the onset, one of the interesting features about why Eric is so good at what he's doing today is his degree was in history. And his first stop here in DC was at the U.S. Capitol Historical Society. So you put that together with his transportation background, and you've got a guy that is deep into how to preserve, present, share history of transportation in town here. So that's a lot of fun. The other thought I had is how much we enjoy at the Historical Society here in Kensington of these collaborations where we enrich our knowledge of our history, not just from what we've got here, and we've got a great archives and a very active, long-tenured historical society, but we love embellishing that with information that comes from other areas, other historical societies, small museums, so that's really a treat. Just a couple of upcomings. On April 25th, the Racial Justice Committee here in Kensington, the Town of Kensington, and Kensington Historical Society are sponsoring a film that's associated with our annual Juneteenth celebration, and the film is Back to the Merry-Go-Round. I cannot read my own writing, I apologize. The history of segregation and desegregation of Glen Echo Amusement Park. And that's going to be at the, again, my writing, so Broff Forbes Cultural Center right up on University Boulevard. So flyer in the back, you don't need to remember any of that, get a flyer and come. KHS is sponsoring a program here, May 15th, on the history of Georgetown Prep. And it's kind of goes back into the Jesuits and Georgetown University and how and why the school migrated out to the suburbs and what all that was about. And then, of course, in May, we start our concert season. So Saturday mornings down on Howard Avenue Park. Everybody enjoys that. I can't thank you enough. I think this has been a super presentation, a lot of great images, super information. I learned a ton, so let's thank Eric. He will stay around a bit and really encourage you to come up and
come up and
enjoy the material he brought, have some refreshments, pick up some flyers on the way out. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.